Hey everybody, this is chapter 13 of Adorno's Critique of Political Economy by Dirk Braunstein. Chapter 13 is titled Something's Missing. Its sections include Section 1, Actually This Has Always Been Possible. Section 2, Paradise with Its Bloody Hands. 3, Move to Different Places. 4, Realization Alone Would Transcend Exchange. 5, This Core. So let's rock. Quote, to put the subject by, quote, the rest next time, end quote. Quote, it is next time, end quote. Lewis Carroll, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. Section 1. Actually, this has always been possible. Quote, in a sense, notes Rolf Tiedemann, quote, negative dialectics is the attempt, one already made against epistemology, to enable logic to speak, instead of continuing to translate speech into logic. The concept of, quote, concept, unquote, which is what is at issue here, would be, quote, fulfilled, unquote, at best through the name. If one were to be had, a name would make it possible to reap the reward that philosophy had vainly sought under the heading of, quote, intellectual intuition, end quote. Namely, the non-identical determinate thing, the inextinguishable color of the concrete. The Origin of German Tragic Drama by Benjamin, in the Origin of German Tragic Drama, Benjamin claimed for philosophy Adam's action of naming things, quote, the word, ... reclaiming its name-giving rights, end quote. Benjamin. Adorno did not follow him down this road, end quote. Rolf Tiedemann. Footnote. Adorno writes to Elisabeth Lenk that he has, quote, tried so hard my whole life long to make logic speak as I once described it, end quote. Adorno. Letter from Adorno to Lenk, 18th of May, 1967. The positive theological philosophy of language presented by Benjamin in the article On Language as Such in the Language of Man is something Adorno cannot claim for himself. Footnote. If this essay can be said to have a quintessence, then this can be seen as its end. Quote, the language can be seen at its end. Quote, the language of an entity is the medium in which its mental being is communicated. The uninterrupted flow of this communication runs through the whole of nature, from the lowest form of existence to man and from man to God. Man communicates himself to God through name, which he gives to nature, and in proper names is his own kind, and to nature he gives names according to the communication that he receives from her, for the whole of nature, too, is imbued with a nameless spoken language, the residue of the creative word of God, which is perversed in man as the cognizing names, and above man as the judgment suspended over man. The language of nature is comparable to a secret password that each century passes to the next in his own language. But the meaning of the password is the century's language itself. All higher language is a translation of lower ones, until in ultimate clarity the word of God unfolds, which is the unity of this movement made up of language, end quote. Benjamin. End footnote. For Adorno, who in contrast to Benjamin appears, quote, to have had instilled little faith in the image world of childhood, end quote. Tiedemann. It is instead animals which exist, quote, without any purpose recognizable to men, end quote. In this existence, animals, quote, hold out as if for expression their own names, utterly impossible to exchange. This makes animals so beloved by children, their contemplation so blissful. Quote, I am a rhinoceros, end quote, signifies the shape of the rhinoceros, end quote. Adorno. Here Adorno sees play and, quote, purposeless activity, end quote, as honoring what his philosophy, quote, an effort toward that intentionless thing for which the inadequate word, quote, name was chosen, end quote, seeks to develop on the level of society. Footnote. Quote, just because, bracket, the playing child, in bracket, deprives the things with which he plays of their mediated usefulness, he seeks to rescue in them what is benign towards men, and not what subserves the exchange relation. That equally deforms men and things. The little trucks travel nowhere, and the tiny barrels on them are empty, yet they remain true to their destiny by not performing, not participating in the process of abstraction that levels down that destiny, but instead abide as allegories of what they are specifically for. Scattered, it is true, but not ensnared, they wait to see whether society will finally remove the social stigma on them, whether the vital process between men and things, praxis, will cease to be practical, end quote. Adorno. End footnote. Thomas Mann once lamented to his, quote, honored friend, end quote, Adorno, that the latter's work contains not even, quote, a single positive word, that vouchsafed even the vaguest glimpse of the true society which we are forced to postulate, end quote. Thomas Mann. Footnote. Letter from Mann to Adorno, 30th of October, 1852, end footnote. In his response, Adorno refuses to construe for Mann or for himself what a better state might look like. Quote, if anything in Hegel, and in those who turned him right away, quote, if anything in Hegel, and in those who turned Hegel right way up, has become part of my very flesh and blood, it is an asceticism with regards to any unmediated expression of the positive. This truly is a case of asceticism, believe me, since the opposite impulse, a tendency to the unfettered expression of hope, really lies much closer to my own nature. But I have the constant feeling that we are merely encouraging the cause of untruth if we turn prematurely to the positive and fail to persevere in the negative, end quote. Letter from Adorno to Mann, 1st of December, 1952. Adorno bristles at all, quote, adductions about a, quote, future society, end quote. Not only have all upstanding human beings regarded this point with a kind of taboo, not least Marx, who left the depiction of the society of the future to Babel. I don't want to say that this exercise should be abandoned. The vision of a just society has to be the center of force, endowing every sentence written about sociology with light. But it is not beneficial to look at the sun, end quote. Letter from Adorno to Ernst Kux, 26th of January 1955. Horkheimer had already criticized Babel's vision of revolution in the article The Authoritarian State. End footnote. Referring to the ban on images, which, quote, occupies a position of central importance in the religions that believe in salvation, end quote. Adorno argues that, quote, to speak directly of the ultimate things, end quote, is no longer possible. Quote, the impotent word that calls them by name weakens them, but naivete and a defiant casualness in expressing metaphysical ideas reveal their lack of grounding, end quote. Adorno. The positivity of what is given is only, quote, an aspect, end quote, of it. One which, quote, cannot be reduced, end quote, to things as they are. Otherwise, Hegel's statement that, quote, what is rational is actual, and what is actual is rational, end quote, would simply be a call to, quote, capitulate before reality, end quote. While the establishment of positivity would be the last possible act of any theory. If this were the case, Adorno notes, one would effectively have to, quote, choose between theology, end quote, that is, between the idea that what exists is more than itself, quote, and tautology, end quote, or the idea that what exists is all that there is. Quote, in this case, end quote, Adorno admits, quote, I would prefer theology, end quote. Adorno, even though this choice would mean abandoning the knowledge that no non-identical has a positive existence, quote, utopia amounts to representing a non-identical as a being, that is, to representing it immediately, and there is a fraudulent element in the objective substance of the philosophy which does this, end quote, Adorno. That is, if this philosophy does not simply outright indulge in affirmation through description. Apropos, quote, ban on images, end quote, it is worth noting that Adorno at times refers to certain motifs from Judaism, including this motif, something not unusual for a thinker in the German context, whose philosophy emerged at a time in which there was still a German Jewry able to contribute to public debate. For this reason, several authors have regarded Adorno as a Jew as well, including Martin J. Quote, and yet the German Jew in Adorno did not die with his father's name. Even in exile in America, his manners remained those of the cultured Central European haute bourgeois, end quote. Voila, a German Jew in Adorno. In a conversation between Micha Brumlik and Evelina Goodman-Tau, one which is not exactly sparing in its deployment of cliches, Goodman-Tau wants clarity on this matter. Quote, but what is Jewish about Adorno?
I was thinking maybe some of your friends would want to go to Beaver Dam since you're going on a weekend now.
Yeah. I'll have to see. Thank you. Between Micha Brumlik and Evelina Goodman-Tau, one which is not exactly sparing in its deployment of cliches, Goodman-Tau wants clarity on this matter. Quote, but what is Jewish about Adorno? Where is Adorno a German thinker? Where is he a Jewish thinker? End quote. Brumlik answers that Adorno is a Jewish thinker simply because, quote, he affirms again and again the biblical metaphor of the ban on images, end quote. Brumlik. Setting aside the fact that the biblical ban on images is not in fact a metaphor, but rather a literal command, the claim that someone who refers to this ban in his philosophy thinks Jewishly appears especially dubious, given that the Old Testament carries religious significance not only in Judaism. Yet if the existence of specifically Jewish religious motifs is accepted, but that of a Jewish mode of thinking rejected, the question of whether or not Adorno is a Jew is more or less irrelevant. According to the halakhic, I'm saying that right, Halakhic definition, Adorno was certainly not a Jew, as his mother was a Catholic and his father a baptized Protestant. Furthermore, Adorno neither refers to himself as a Jew in existing sources, nor did Adorno practice any form of religious Judaism. For much of his life, the Jewish community was as foreign to him as any other religious community. In a 1937 letter to Horkheimer written during a voyage across the Atlantic, Adorno describes some of the Jewish passengers with a malice, which at the time could still be regarded as anti-religious polemic. Quote, the ship was overflowing with Eastern European Jews eating with their yarmulkes, don't know why I said that, although it's just why I read it. My grandfather used to say, what did he used to say? He used to say, pronounce it mad weird, yarmulkes on their head, extruding religious ululations, and committing racial defilement through their overall behavior. On Saturday, one of their medicine men or ritual murderers gave a long speech in Yiddish in the public reading room. By the way, he looked a little bit like Trotsky, ... and co. Letter from Adorno to Horkheimer, 6th of July, 1937. Only after the war does Adorno reach a kind of negative identification with Judaism as a community of fate. When his father complains about the manners of some Jews whom he encounters while visiting New York, Adorno answers him as follows, quote, I am reluctant to correspond with you about the Jews, ... After 6 million have been murdered, it goes against my instincts to dwell on the manner of those few who survived, whom I incidentally do not need to like. In addition to that, 50% Goy, the 50% Goy in me feels somehow responsible for the Jewish persecution, so I am therefore quite especially allergic to everything that is said against the chosen people, end quote. Letter from Adorno to his parents, 11th of March, 1946. In raising this issue, the point is not to imply that an affiliation with Judaism is somehow contemptuous. That this even has to be emphasized to avoid misunderstandings is a disgrace. Rather, the point is that it is noteworthy that Adorno is constantly associated with Judaism by others. Footnote. For example, this has recently been done by Karl Gerasi, or Gerasi, 2008, and footnote. He himself formulates this succinctly when Adorno says about himself that he, quote, escaped by accident, end quote, and, quote, by rights should have been killed, end quote. Adorno. The right, parenthesis, Recht, in parenthesis, of which he speaks here is the governing law, Recht, of the Third Reich, in which Germans defined who was a Jew and hence to be murdered. As long as to be a Jew is to be tainted with the whiff of what does not fully belong, the designation, quote, Jew, is always still, whether intentionally or unintentionally, a criterion of exclusion containing all the associated cliches. Footnote. Tellingly, Peter Bürger describes Adorno, quote, the Jewish intellectual who had escaped extermination, end quote, as being, quote, constantly on the run, end quote, guided by, quote, hatred, and, quote, dealing blows to all sides, end quote, Bürger. Of course, what is meant here are not literally blows, but merely Adorno's harsh yet thoroughly substantive criticisms of Heidegger. End footnote. In any case, it is illegitimate to engage in the same practice as those who, as a matter of law, arbitrarily decided who was a Jew and who was not. When it came to the matter of religion itself, Adorno was always aware, quote, that the struggle against magic waged by both Christianity and Judaism is itself magical through and through, magic against magic, end quote. Letter from Adorno to Maria Luisa Kaschnitz, 11th of June, 1965, end footnote. In a surprisingly conciliatory conversation between Adorno and Bloch from 1964, the two considered the relationship between society and utopia. Quote, Bloch. There would not have been a French Revolution, as Marx stated, without the heroic illusions that natural law engendered. Of course, they did not become real, and what did become real of them, the free market of the bourgeoisie, is not at all that which was dreamed of. bracket, thought of, end bracket, wished for, hoped, demanded as utopia. Thus now, if a world were to emerge that is hindered for apparent reasons, but that is entirely possible. One could say, it is astonishing that it, bracket, does, end bracket, not, bracket, exist, end bracket. If such a world, in which hunger and immediate wants were eliminated, entirely in contrast to death, if this world would finally just, quote, be allowed to breathe, end quote, and were set free, there would not only be platitudes that would come out at the end and gray prose and a complete lack of prospects and perspectives in regard to existence here and over there, but there would also be freedom from earning instead of freedom to earn. And this would provide some space for such richly prospective doubt, and the decisive incentive toward utopia. That is the meaning of Brecht's short sentence, quote, something's missing, end quote. What exactly is missing is unknown. This sentence, which in Mahogany, a play, or I think it's a play, is one of the most profound sentences that Brecht ever wrote, and it is in 2 words. Two footnotes. Well, actually, I'll finish reading the Bloch quote, and then I'll the Bloch quote of Ernst Bloch, and then read the footnotes. What is this quote something? If it is not allowed to be cast in a picture, then I shall portray it as in the process of being, parenthesis, Ziont, in parenthesis. But one should not be allowed to eliminate it as if it, bracket, were not really, in a practical sense, what one could describe as being, quote, what really counts, end quote, end bracket. End quote. Bloch. Footnote. Surprising insofar as the history of their friendship, if it ever was one, readily reveals itself as characterized by mutual misunderstandings. See Schmid-Neuer, 2001. See also Bloch's, quote, hostile, and at times outrageous remarks in Bloch and Reinecke. And footnote. Footnote, in Brecht's, quote, opera about the, quote, Paradise City, or, quote, Golden City, end quote, of Mahogany, the protagonist, Paul Ackerman, wants to leave the city because nothing there is worth staying for. And this is like a bit of dialogue between Jake, Paul, and Joe. Jake. Oh, and Harry. Jake, Paul, why are you running away? Paul, well, what is there to keep me here? Joe, haven't you got gin and cheap whiskey? Paul, they're too cheap. Harry, and peace and concord? Paul, it's too peaceful. Jake, if you feel like eating fish, you can go catch one. Paul, that won't make me happy. Joe, you can smoke. Paul, you can smoke. Harry, you can nod off. Paul, you can sleep. Jake, you can swim. Paul, you can pick a banana. Joe, you can look at the water. Paul just shrugs his shoulders. Harry, you can forget. Paul, but something is missing. And that's from Brecht's Mahogany. End footnote. And Adorno responds to Bloch, quote, we have come strangely close to the ontological proof of God, Ernst. End quote. Block, quote, that surprises me, end quote. Adorno, quote, all of this comes from what you said when you used the phrase borrowed from Brecht, something's missing. A phrase that we actually cannot have if seeds or ferment of what this phrase denotes were not possible. Actually, I would think that unless there is no kind of trace of truth in the ontological proof of God, that is, unless the element of its reality is also already conveyed in the power of the concept itself, there could not only be no utopia, but there could also not be any thinking, end quote. Adorno. Footnote. On the ontological proof of God, see a note by Adorno titled Facet. Quote, my experience with metaphysics began with the Lukácsian theory of epochs imbued with meaning, bracket, from theory of the novel, in bracket, where the glorification of meaning and the horror of meaning's loss appears as the guarantor of its truth, and the loss of objective reason remains unnoticed. In this, there already lies the notion of the loss of the middle, in which the West and the developing countries so happily conform to each other. Bracket, sich gleichhalten, gleichschalten. Translator's note, Gleichschaltung, coordination, was a term used to designate official state policy of forced conformity of all aspects of German society to the Nazi regime. That things were better in the presence of an immanent or transcendental meaning comes to guarantee the latter's truth. This is precisely the argument of necessity criticized by Nietzsche. It is basically already present in the Kantian critique of the ontological proof of God. But isn't something being forgotten? Isn't there ultimately something to every argument? Can such a radical distinction be made between the idea of a utopian state and the idea of truth upon which this state is based? Wouldn't that be two different truths? Is there a difference between the truth of meaning in itself and the truth of the state in which meaning would be necessary? Would be a necessary condition. Would right life be right if what it necessarily required were wrong? Doesn't what was once meaningful here, even negatively meaningful, say something about the truth of meaning? Kant's refutation of the ontological proof of God is true, but also not. With the first sentence, do I not posit the absolute by postulating the absolute's truth? And because the element of every concept comes from something which exists, where should I take the strong concept from? Or is this all fallacy? To think through this, with and against Kant, is my task, and the task of philosophy. I only know one thing. If this isn't it, then everything amounts to nothing, right? Unquote. Adorno. End footnote. The hope that if a concept for something exists, then there also exists a, quote, trace of what it describes, that is, that there also exists the real possibility of this concept being realized, is affirmed by Adorno in Adorno's lecture course, History and Freedom. Therein, Adorno claims that it is only possible to, quote, speak meaningfully of freedom because there are concrete possibilities of freedom, because freedom can be achieved in reality. And in contrast to the entire dialectical tradition of Hegel and Marx, I would almost go so far as to say that actually this has always been possible, that it has been possible at every moment. After all, he claims elsewhere, quote, if there is something bourgeois and anti-dialectical, it is the belief in an only afterwards relation to essential matters. The banal thought comes to one's mind that humanity, quote, is not yet mature, bracket, enough, and bracket, for socialism, end quote. ... The thinking of the classless society has to shake off the logic of this only afterwards. The embodiment of sanity and reason and human's notion of time, or it remains in a bad sense traditionalistic, end quote. Adorno. Section 2. Paradise with its bloody hands. Adorno's preferred theology, at least if he were faced with a choice between theology and tautology, would be a negative, godless theology. The Messiah whom Adorno, doubtless following Benjamin, often borrowed from the Jewish religion as the epitome of realized utopia, has yet to arrive. Footnote. In a preparatory note to his theses, titled On the Concept of History, Benjamin writes that, quote, in the concept of the classless society, Marx secularized the concept of the Messianic age, end quote. Benjamin. Quote, the Messiah, redemption, the angel, and the Antichrist appear in the theses as images, analogies, and parables, not literally. Benjamin does not for a moment think of undertaking the representation of what Marx ultimately achieved in theory and what the working class movement preserved in practice, end quote. Tiedemann. End footnote. Thus, in potentially, quote, crypto-theological, end quote, statements, Adorno invokes a state of salvation which knows neither God nor the Messiah, but which amounts to the realization of the messianic idea. There is not, Adorno claims, quote, a natural scientific truth and a revelatory truth, but rather, insofar as something has been revealed about intra-worldly things, this truth must be an absolutely valid truth, which cannot be divided into merely a natural scientific part and a merely revelatory part. In this, I really believe that ... hard-headed orthodoxy is more experienced with the decisive problem here than is all philosophy of religion, but the consequence I draw from this is that I say no credo, non-credo, end quote. Adorno. Salvation would be, quote, an event which takes place publicly on the stage of history and within the community. It is an occurrence which takes in the visible world and which cannot be conceived apart from such a visible appearance, end quote. Scholem. As Joseph Ratzinger recapitulated in his role as Pope Benedict XVI in the encyclical Spe Salvi, Adorno not only, quote, firmly upheld this total rejection of images, which naturally meant the exclusion of any, quote, image, end quote, of a loving God, end quote. Adorno never came remotely close to imagining, out of an unfulfilled desire for salvation, a God who would promise to one day grant human beings the experience of justice. Footnote. See Ratzinger, 2007. Footnote. In a tangent during his introductory lecture course on epistemology from the winter semester of 1957 to 58, Adorno suggests to his listeners that they should not leave ostensibly religious questions to be answered by those ostensibly responsible for them. Quote, a poster is hanging in our university for a lecture titled God and Immortality, or Death and Immortality, or something along those lines. And as I caught sight of the poster, I knew immediately, without even having looked closer, that this could only be the event of either a Catholic or Protestant student organization. I then checked, and it really was the event of a Catholic student organization. And the fact that I guessed this immediately, actually really shocked me, namely because it shows that this, has really also been commandeered, occupied by the administrative division of the world. That is death and immortality. We all, of course, die in the end, and somehow we indeed probably all hope for immortality, if not for one's own. Then for the immortality of the human beings we love, Such a question only appears at all anymore in the, I would almost say, corporate, or at any rate organizationally defined section of a kind of student organization which spends its time on such things, such as democratic student organizations would probably host a lecture titled Crisis of Parliamentarism, with a question mark, or a socialist organization, a lecture titled, quote, Is Marxism Still Relevant Today? I believe that what actually matters and what really constitutes the relevance of philosophy, is that the epistemological or generally philosophical way of thinking allows one to move beyond the deplorable hardening into branches, beyond this administration of the most important things by whichever experts, who now even present themselves as experts for God and immortality, And that one in fact sees that questions on topics such as death and immortality are not something which can be administered by licensed and calibrated people, end quote. Adorno. End footnote. Quote, the unbearable today, which never seems to end, is given solace by the promise of a reconciliation, a reconciled tomorrow, end quote. Demirovich. Solace which is similar to the belief that one will be justly rewarded after death, and which therefore only veils the reason for the need for consolation. As opposed to this, Adorno is not concerned with solace, but with a place where no one has ever been, because it has not yet existed. He seeks neither to return to God, for God, the, quote, unmediated identification of the rational society with the kingdom of God, end quote, is, quote, one of the most dangerous manipulations, end quote. Nor does he long for the arrival of the Messiah. Rather, the goal of his social critique is the abolition of a society which prevents its members from entering into a humanity which would be worthy of its concept. Quote, the maturation of human beings, end quote, Adorno claims in a seminar, quote, can only mean the end of a prehistory in which there has never been anything like a paradisiacal, I guess that's paradise. I can't pronounce this word. Paradisiacal state, end quote. Adorno. See, not only can I not pronounce German, I can't pronounce English either. The phrase, quote, paradisiacal state, end quote, indicates that while Adorno indeed secularizes religious utopia, Adorno does so without profaning religious utopia. In this, Adorno seeks to bring out its best, which is nothing other than the longing for a state in which, finally, quote, all, bracket, would be, end bracket, well, end quote. Footnote, von Eichendorff, 1966. On the utopian substance of this passage, see Lure, 2003. End footnote. In such a state, religious belief would probably have to be given over to the population of heaven, but the world itself arranged like the place which belief envisions heaven to be. Hence, negative utopia can only be expressed in theological categories, simply because realized utopia has no immediate existence. That being said, what today appears as theological utopian could be the most mundane thing in a reconciled world. For Adorno, the, quote, most profound reason, the metaphysical reason, end quote, that, quote, one can actually talk about utopia only in a negative way, end quote, lies in the existence of death. Quote, every attempt to describe or portray utopia in a simple way, i.e., it will be like this, would be an attempt to avoid the antinomy of death and to speak about the elimination of death as if death did not exist, end quote. Adorno. This antinomy is also described by Jean Almery, I have a bunch of pieces by Jean Almery on the channel, as, quote, the rejection of all dialectic, the negation of a negation of a negation, end quote, Amaury, which comes along with the, quote, totally bad tidings, the annunciation of the end, end quote, Amaury. All progress beyond the existing state of affairs is negated by death. Before death, which always has the final say, everything is the same. All which exists is ultimately all there is. What would appear as happiness in the, quote, light of redemption, end quote, Adorno. Is the shame of all past and future generations before the darkness of the inevitable. Having, quote, repressed all that is, quote, horrific, end quote, in death, end quote, whose, quote, scandalous imposition, end quote, is, quote, a humiliation without compare, that we put up with, not in humility, but as the humiliated, end quote. Amaury. Bourgeois civilization tries, quote, either to ennoble it or to corral it with hygiene. The futility of false life must not be allowed to enter consciousness through the ghastliness that death reveals, nor the fact that death is an offense to human beings, one that should be abolished rather than celebrated in the name of tragedy, end quote. Letter from Adorno to Mann, 18th of January, 1954. As it is in the fundamental ontology of Heidegger and his followers. Footnote, quote, lesser authentics raise their eyes reverently before death, but their spiritual attitude, infatuated with the living, disregards death. The thorn in theology without which salvation is unthinkable is removed. According to the concept of theology, nothing natural has gone through death without metamorphosis. In the man-to-man relationship, there can be no eternity now and here, and certainly not in the relationship of man to God, a relationship that seems to pat him on the shoulder, end quote. Adorno. End footnote. In view of the injustice, quote, which death does to every single individual, end quote, quote, surrendering to the inevitable, ... becomes its recommendation, end quote. Adorno. This afflicts every utopia which, quote, enlists the service of theology, end quote, in hopes of overcoming death, while treating theology as something which, quote, has to be kept out of sight, end quote. Benjamin. In view of the, quote, universally, end quote, practice distancing from utopia, quote, oh, that's just utopia, and oh, that's possible only in the land of cocaine, bracket, and in fact, in bracket, that shouldn't bracket exist, and bracket at all, end quote, end quote. Adorno. Adorno's notion that death is, quote, unavoidable, Adorno's notion that death is, quote, avoidable and criticizable, or at any rate the precise opposite of what thinking should actually identify with, end quote, leads to the denial of the wish that all suffering be overcome. Against this, Adorno takes the view that, quote, the question about the elimination of death is indeed the crucial point, end quote, something which Adorno argues, quote, can be ascertained very easily, end quote. Quote, you only have to speak about the elimination of death sometime with a so-called well-disposed person, bracket, quote, wohlgesinnten, end quote, Menschen, end bracket, ... Then you will get an immediate reaction, ... Yes, if death were eliminated, if people would no longer die, that would be the most terrible and most horrible thing. I would say that it is precisely this form of reaction that actually opposes the utopian consciousness most of the time. The identification with death is that which goes beyond the identification of people with the existing social conditions and in which they are extended. Utopian consciousness means a consciousness for which the possibility that people no longer have to die, does not have anything horrible about it, but is, on the contrary, that which one actually wants, end quote. Adorno. Footnote. On the, quote, wohlgesinnten, end quote, Menschen, the, quote, well-disposed person, end quote, or the person with a, quote, benevolent attitude, end quote, see Adorno, 1973, end footnote. Thoughts such as these, which by all means take, quote, theological risks, end quote, immediately provoke the well-known controversies, quote, yes, buts, end quote, and there is nothing in the world, however bad, for which there are not the strongest possible arguments that it must be so and cannot under any circumstances be changed, end quote. Adorno. Given that such arguments often present themselves as scholarly nuance, that, quote, this, quote, but, end quote, is the very dogma of positivist social science in our own day, end quote. Adorno. It is no surprise that, quote, some social scientists inspired by critical theory fear that the elevation of theological motifs in this mode of thinking only comes at the price of non-committal, of empty generality, and thus also of affirmation, end quote. Brumlich. Footnote. Quote, after all, a scientific discipline concerned with its own continued existence could allow itself to incorporate into its very categories of inquiry fear of death, reflection upon it, the struggle for its elimination, and the need for happiness. Regarding these preconditions of critical theory, the late Horkheimer said the following, quote, to not merely come to know the world from the perspective of something so self-evident, bracket, expiration, end bracket, and that which immediately precedes it, bracket, inescapable loneliness, in bracket, but rather to come to know oneself and one's own goals from this perspective would not be something like cynicism, but rather the beginning of knowledge about the identity of a blind life with inexorable reality, end quote, Schmidt-Neuer. Brackets in original quoted from Horkheimer, 1988, end footnote. A radical utopia as socially critical theory's point of refuge can only be imagined by sociology as resignation in view of the worst, and never as the opposite of resignation. For, quote, even utopia is not immune to the imperatives of the cultural environment. It is characteristic of modern culture that it constantly devours its own image, even the image of apocalypse itself. If it is difficult to appreciate the urgency of the cultural criticism of the 1920s and 1930s, it is not because it has become less meaningful, but because the catastrophe has become a permanent fixture. The apocalypse is boring. Worse, its image is ubiquitous in the culture industry. The sheer weight of the apocalypse obliterates utopia. The catastrophe no longer conjures up images of redemption. Instead, it produces cynicism, which is no less ideological. Cynicism is the total embrace of the power of reality as fate, or as a joke, the, quote, unhappy consciousness, end quote, of powerlessness, end quote. Robinbach. Against this, the ubiquitous fear of death owing to the fact that life no longer lives is only apparently paradoxical. After all, quote, the less people really live, or perhaps more correctly, the more they become aware that they have not really lived, the more abrupt and frightening death becomes for them, and the more it appears as a misfortune. It is as if, they were corpses from the first, The terror of death today is largely the terror of seeing how much the living resemble it, end quote. Adorno. That's a pretty metal line. The identification with death can be seen as the desire for an end to this terror which life causes. It is a longing directed towards an end to suffering, but one which can only imagine suffering's end as abstract negation, not as the abolition of terror in this world. Quote, if human beings are measured by their utopia, by their hope, then it's safe to say that as their standards have increased, they have become extremely modest, end quote. Horkheimer. Footnote, quote, whatever utopia is, whatever can be imagined as utopia, this is the transformation of the totality, It seems to me that what people have lost subjectively in regard to consciousness is very simply the capability to imagine the totality as something that could be completely different, end quote. Adorno. End footnote. Horkheimer and Adorno oppose this, claiming that they, quote, want to make sure not to affirm the entire historical process along with Marx by claiming, for example, that revolution leads to harmony. Humanity cannot realize paradise with its bloody hands, end quote. Adorno and Horkheimer. Footnote. Along these lines, the protagonist in Italo Svevo's novel Zeno's Conscience says the following to a newborn, quote, the minutes now passing may actually be pure, but all the centuries that prepared for your coming were certainly not, end quote. The momentary happiness of the individual is sullied by the prior unhappiness of countless others. End footnote. This categorical rejection of a better society in the future to be paid for as the price of history up to the present, the assurance that while this society might be better, it would hardly be reconciled, runs throughout the entirety of Adorno's work. In a 1949 letter to Horkheimer, Adorno writes of the unbearable notion of a progress, quote, based on the terrible agonies of previous generations, which could not have had any idea that they served, in a certain sense, as history's, quote, guinea pigs, end quote, so that in the most distant future things might be better for the species, end quote. Letter from Adorno to Horkheimer, 28th of May, 1949. End footnote. In this lecture course, in his lecture course, History and Freedom, from the winter semester of 1964 to 65, Adorno would revisit this problem. Quote, the identification with the universal enters deeply into the fiber of Marxism, notwithstanding the much cruder epistemological position of Marx and the Marxists. For there you find something like the belief that when ultimately the universal takes over and the concept is victorious, individuals will indeed come into their own. And this factor will ensure that all the suffering and the wasted individuality of history will somehow be made good. This is an issue that, to the best of my knowledge, was first commented on critically by Ivan Turgenev in the 19th century. Turgenev maintained that even the prospect of a completely classless society could not console him for the fate of all those who had suffered to no purpose and had fallen by the wayside. End quote. Adorno. For reconciliation to succeed, it would need to embrace the unreconciled dead. Section 3. Moved to different places. For Adorno, quote, utopia is essentially ... the bracket, determinate, and bracket, negation of that which merely is, and bracket, yet, and bracket, by concretizing itself as something at false, it always points at the same time to what should be ... falsum, the false thing, index sui e veri. That means that the true thing determines itself via the false thing, or via that which makes itself falsely known, and insofar as ... we do not know what the correct thing would be, we know exactly to be sure what the false thing is. End quote. Adorno. In a letter to... end quote Adorno. Because, quote, utopia only expresses itself in configurations of elements of what is, and not immediately, end quote. Utopia can, quote, only be grasped as the answer to particular questions, not in a free-floating manner, but rather only as the moment of dialectical reversal, end quote. Adorno. This is the reason for the ban on images, which Adorno also refers to in Negative Dialectics, when Adorno criticizes a, quote, deficiency in Kantian theory, end quote. He claims owes to the, quote, elusive abstract side of the intelligible character, end quote. However, Adorno also argues that this deficiency, quote, has a touch of the truth of the anti-image ban, which post-Kantian philosophers, including Marx, extended to all concepts of positivity. Like freedom, the intelligible character as a subjective possibility is a thing that comes to be, not a thing that is. It would be a betrayal to incorporate it in existence by description, even by the most cautious description, in the right condition, as in the Jewish theologumenon. All things would differ only a little from the way they are, but bracket, how things would then be cannot be conceived even in the slightest, end bracket. End quote. Adorno. Footnote. Wiebrecht Ries notes, quote, that Kant as well was deeply influenced by the Old Testament ban on images. In the Critique of Judgment, Kant praises the demand that, quote, thou shalt not make unto thyself any graven image nor any likeness, end quote, as the most sublime sentence in the Bible, end quote. Ries, with a quote from Kant in the middle. End footnote. Adorno invokes this Theologumenon as early as 1942 in a letter to Edward M. David, the translator of the English version of his essay on Spengler. In order to clarify a difficult passage of the text, quote, think of the Jewish legend. When the Messiah comes, everything will be exactly as it is today, but the whole will be very, very little different, end quote. Letter from Adorno to David, 3rd of July, 1941. Footnote. This motif also emerges in Minima Moralia as the subject of a childhood memory. Quote, to a child returning from a holiday, home seems new, fresh, festive. Yet nothing has changed there since he left, only because duty has now been forgotten, of which each piece of furniture, window, lamp was otherwise a reminder. Is the house given back to this Sabbath peace? And for minutes one is at home in the never-returning world of rooms, nooks, and corridors in a way that makes the rest of life there a lie. No differently will the world one day appear, almost unchanged in its constant feast daylight, or feast day light, when it stands no longer under the lull of labor, and when for homecomers duty has the lightness of holiday play. End quote. Adorno. End footnote. Adorno apparently adopts this motif from Benjamin, who in his work on Kafka refers to the poem titled Das Bucklige Männlein, or The Little Hunchbacked Man, from Des Knaben Wunderhorn, or The Boy's Magic Horn, an early 19th century collection of German folk poems. Quote, this little man is at home in distorted life. He will disappear with the coming of the Messiah who, a great rabbi once said, will not wish to change the world by force, but will merely make a slight adjustment in it, end quote. Benjamin. Footnote. The reference here comes from Sholem. See letter from Sholem to Benjamin, 9th of July, 1934. Benjamin uses this motif as early as 1932, quote, thought image, end quote, Denkbild, titled In the Sun, end quote. Quote, the Hasidim have a saying about the world to come. Everything there will be arranged just as it is with us. The room we have now will be just the same in the world to come. Where a child lies sleeping, it will sleep in the world to come. The clothes we are wearing we shall also wear in the next world. Everything will be the same as here, only a little bit different, end quote. Benjamin. End footnote. Bloch also invokes this saying as a, quote, wise rabbi, end quote, in Traces, a collection of aphorisms published in 1930, prompting Sholem to claim to Benjamin that, quote, the great rabbi with the profound dictum on the messianic kingdom who appears in Bloch is none other than I, myself. What a way to achieve fame, exclamation point. It was one of my first ideas about the Kabbalah, end quote. Footnote. Quote, another rabbi, a true Kabbalist, once said, to bring about the kingdom of freedom, it is not necessary that everything be destroyed and an entirely new world begin. Rather, this cup or that brush or that stone and so all things must only be shifted a little. Because this, quote, a little, end quote, is hard to do, and its measure so hard to find, humanity cannot do it in this world. Instead, this is why the Messiah comes. Bracket, in saying this wise rabbi too, in bracket, spoke out not for creeping progress, completely for the leap of the lucky glimpse and the lucky hand, end quote. Bloch. End footnote. However, it appears that Sholom's memory deceives Sholem both here and when Sholem subsequently claims that the appropriation of Sholem's saying revealed to him, quote, what honors one can garner for oneself with an apocryphal sentence, end quote. Letter from Sholem to Benjamin, 9th of July, 1934. For, quote, Benjamin and Bloch's attributions were not actually wrong, end quote. The saying really did come from a rabbi, the Tzaddik, I don't know if I'm saying that right, Tzaddik, Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, quote, who knew how to tell the tale of exchange and change to something only very slightly different, end quote. Broca. The Theologumenon, which evidently made such an impression on Adorno, in fact has its origin in Nachman's tale, titled The Exchanged Children, which contains the following passage, quote, they showed him the throne, and he saw that it was extremely tall. He went over to the throne and gazed at it. ... The late king had devised each detail with such wisdom that no person could understand its significance until an extraordinarily wise person came along who would understand the concept. ... You would then know how to exchange and arrange all things correctly. Bracket. He then saw that, bracket, end bracket, the same was true of the bed. He understood that it had to be moved somewhat, and the lamp likewise had to have the lamp's position adjusted. The birds and animals also had to be moved to different places. Thus a bird would have to be taken from one place and set in another place, ... Bracket, all the animals and birds, in bracket, then began to sing a very wonderful melody. Each one functioned properly, end quote. Nachman to Breslov, 1983. The social totality cannot be negated as a whole, which is to say, cannot be negated abstractly. The only way it could be changed would be through the determinate negation of its elements, where the social totality quantifies everything. Variability can only be hoped for in what universal quantification rejects as rubbish. This in turn leads to the non-identical, to the, quote, the other, exempt from the mechanism of the social process of production and reproduction, bracket, not subjected to the reality principle, end bracket, end quote, Adorno. Or in other words, to what, quote, falls through the net, end quote, the most minute thing, end quote. A thing containing what actually, quote, cries out for philosophical explanation, end quote. Adorno. What wants through philosophical explanation to transcend the totality from within this minute thing. Footnote. In view of, quote, compactly dovetailed reality, end quote, Adorno, the, quote, smallest intramundane traits would be of relevance to the absolute, for the micrological view cracks the shells of what, measured by the subsuming cover concept, is helplessly isolated and explodes its identity, the delusion that it is but a specimen, end quote. Adorno, end footnote. And it is by no means inevitable that the ultimate revolution, for this is what is at issue here, would arrive with a bang. Triumph over the whole does not have to be accompanied by enormous noise. Well, let me repeat that. And it is by no means inevitable that the ultimate revolution, for this is what is at issue here, would arrive with a bang. Triumph over the whole does not have to be accompanied by enormous noise. To stay with the metaphor, what would fall would not clatter, for what would fall to determinate negation would no longer be falling. There would be no impact. The revolution would come on velvet palls. Were this triumph to succeed, then indeed, quote, virtually nothing, bracket, would have, end bracket, were this triumph to succeed, then, quote, virtually nothing, bracket, would have, end bracket, made all well, end quote. As Adorno writes in the libretto of his light opera, Der Schatz des Indianer Joe, the treasure of Indian Joe, evidently in view of the Hasidic motif cited above. Section 4. Realization alone would transcend exchange. Adorno criticizes exchange as, quote, the rational form of mythical ever-sameness, unquote, as a constant cycle of giving and taking in which, quote, every act, revokes the other, end quote. Adorno. Through the, quote, unjust exchange of labor power for wages, that is, where production and circulation come into contact, where, quote, exchange is by no means pure circulation anymore, end quote, and, quote, the sphere of production itself is already competition or circulation, end quote. Adorno. Labor puts something new into circulation, while the stasis of the system is guaranteed by its perpetual internal dynamics. Adorno argues that for exchange to make, quote, well all, end quote, it would have to live up to a further possibility enabled by its descent from the principle of identity. It would have to become just, quote, in society as it ought to be, bracket, exchange, end bracket, would not be only abolished but fulfilled, end quote. Adorno. Although, quote, humanness requires that the law of an eye for an eye, a quid pro quo, be brought to an end, that the infamous exchange of equivalents, in which age-old myth is recapitulated in rational economics, cease, end quote. It is also the case that this process, quote, has its dialectical crux in the requirement that what rises above exchange not fall back behind it, that the suspension of exchange not once again cost human beings, as the objects of order, the full fruits of their labor. The abolition of the exchange of equivalents would be its fulfillment. As long as equality reigns as law, the individual is cheated of equality, end quote. Adorno. In this fulfillment, each would finally, quote, receive what, quote, exchange essentially always only promised to them, only to let them down, end quote. Footnote, quote, as pathetic as it is to have something from someone, so too is a relationship hollowed out when it is only nourished by memory and no longer yields happiness. The demand for happiness is legitimate. One doesn't want to be bored with human beings. Hence my thesis that exchange in a humane society would not only be eliminated, but also fulfilled appears to extend into the private realm, but indeed in this it becomes a disgrace. This thesis instructs as to how much the immediacy of the private is an illusion, end quote. Adorno. Quote, the world beyond exchange would be one in which no one participating in an exchange would be cheated of what belonged to him. If reason were to skip over individual interests in an abstract way, without Aristotelian equity, Billigkeit, it would violate justice, and universality itself would reproduce particularity in the bad sense. Dwelling on, lingering with, the concrete is an inextinguishable aspect of anything that frees itself from particularity. At the same time, that moment of emancipation shows the specificity of particularity to be just as limited as the blind domination of a totality that does not respect particularity. End quote. Adorno. End footnote. If workers were no longer deprived of the real earnings by the owners of capital, for whom they work, then, quote, the category of exchange would abolish itself, end quote, because, quote, the exchange of equivalents would become truth, end quote. Adorno. This would also cause the disintegration of the system of all other economic categories, such as class, commodity, money, and capital. Exchange would no longer be economic, and humanity would be liberated from, quote, bracket just and bracket exchange, by bracket exchange and bracket fulfilling itself just bracket justly and bracket, end quote. Adorno. However, this insight does not lead Adorno to desire something along the lines of an abstract negation of the principle of equality on which exchange is based. After all, quote, if we proclaim to the greater glory of the irreducibly qualitative, that parity should no longer be the ideal rule, end quote. We should simply, we would simply, quote, be creating excuses for recidivism into ancient injustice. From olden times, the main characteristic of the exchange of equivalents has been that unequal things would be exchanged in its name, that the surplus value of labor would be appropriated, end quote. Adorno. Footnote. Along these lines, Adorno claims, following in his lecture course Fragen der Dialektik, Questions of Dialectics, quote, for example, it is simple or certainly fairly evident to determine, and indeed we have done this quite abundantly in this course, that the universality of the principle of exchange, and hence the reduction to an abstract general concept, is actually the vehicle of identification in the real society in which we live. In other words, we non-identical individual beings become identical, that is, commensurable by means of exchange. And in this way, so too does the entire world become an identical, that is, a totality. Yet if it were now claimed that, well, in light of this principle of exchange must simply be done away with, that in other words, things must no longer be determined by like for like, then this would be a regression behind the principle of exchange. That is, this would then simply mean that no standard of comparison would exist at all anymore, and that in the place of the rationality contained in the principle of exchange, forms of the immediate appropriation, the immediate violence, whatever you want to call it, of the privilege of the monopoly would now assert themselves. So the critique of the principle of exchange as an identifying principle of thought should absolutely be augmented with a clause that actually, in general, the idea of free and just exchange must first be fulfilled anyway for the world to be delivered from exchange, or from revenge, as it is called quite analogously in Nietzsche's work. End quote. Adorno, Questions of Dialectics. End footnote. Quote, if reason were to skip over individual interest in an abstract way, end quote, that is through blind negation, this, quote, this quote would reproduce particularity in the bad sense, dwelling on, lingering with, the concrete is an inextinguishable aspect of anything that frees itself from particularity. At the same time, that moment of emancipation shows the specificity of particularity to be just as limited as the blind domination of a totality that does not respect particularity. End quote. Adorno. While exchange in existing society is mediated by value, an Adornian solution to this cannot be the replacement of exchange of equivalents with an immediate exchange which is unjust. As Adorno argues in Negative Dialectics, echoing a point he makes in Reflections on Class Theory, quote, if comparability as a category of measure were simply annulled, the rationality which is inherent in the bracket exchange and bracket principle, as ideology of course, but also as a promise, would give way to direct appropriation, to force, and nowadays to naked privilege of monopolies and cliques, end quote. Adorno. Footnote. Quote, by quote, comparability as a category of measure, end quote. Adorno does not refer to money or some other de facto means of measure, but rather the principle of equality, which first makes measurement possible and creates the, quote, necessity of exchanging like for like, end quote, to begin with. End footnote. Given his belief that, quote, bracket, it certainly cannot be said that, end bracket, exchange will have ceased to take place, end quote. In a post-capitalist society, it is much rather the case that in Adorno's utopia, every exchange will be just in itself, without particular justice being annulled by a totality superordinate to all individuals. That means superordinate means like the opposite of subordinate. Adorno claims that, quote, when we criticize the exchange principle as the identifying principle of thought, we want to realize the ideal of free and just bracket exchange, end bracket. To date, this ideal is only a pretext. Its realization alone would transcend bracket exchange, end bracket. Bracket if, bracket, critical theory has shown it up for what it is, as exchange of things that are equal and yet unequal. Our critique of the inequality with inequality aims at equality too. For all our skepticism of the rancor involved in the bourgeois egalitarian ideal that tolerates no qualitative difference. If no man had part of his labor withheld from him anymore, rational identity would be a fact, and society would have transcended the identifying mode of thinking. I'm going to copy that down. Sorry, I know this is annoying, but it's because of some good shit. I'm going to play some on hold music with my mouth. Okay, thank you for that. Let me do that. As Tiedemann claims, this precisely does not mean that happiness, quote, is a plural tantum. Happiness is either happiness of the species or it does not exist, end quote. Tiedemann. The, quote, image of happiness without shame, end quote, shows a human being who, as an individual, both phylogenetically and socially tied to the species, would no longer be a mere specimen, yet one who would not stand opposed to society as an outcast. Utopia would be the, quote, subject's non-identity without sacrifice, end quote. Adorno. Equality in the bad sense, which propagates the, quote, familiar argument of tolerance, end quote, according to which all human beings are said to be equal, would be transcended in a society, quote, in which people could be different without fear, end quote. Adorno. Footnote, quote, humanity becomes the most general and empty form of privilege. It is strictly suited to a form of consciousness which no longer suffers any privileges, yet which finds itself under the spell of privilege. Such universal humanity, however, is ideology. It caricatures of the equal rights everything which bears a human face, since it hides from men the unalleviated discriminations of societal power, differences between hunger and overabundance, between spirit and docile idiocy. Chastely moved, man lets himself be addressed through man. It doesn't cost anyone anything, end quote. Adorno. I should repeat that last sentence. Chastely moved man, lowercase, lets himself be addressed through man, uppercase M. It doesn't cost anyone anything, end quote. Adorno. End footnote. It, quote, would not be a unitary state, but the realization of universality in the reconciliation of differences, end quote. Adorno. A, quote, state of differentiation without domination, with the differentiated participating in each other, end quote. Adorno. Footnote, quote, only once the totality dissolves, a totality which exists as long as a whole raises itself up as such, by creating and excluding something non-identical, foreign, other, will humanity exist. Accordingly, humanity does not represent something which already exists in principle, but rather is understood here as an entirely new and unique stage of history, of acting and of thinking. After all, humanity is beyond all totality conceived so comprehensively. It is, quote, plurality, an association of free individual human beings, end quote. End quote. Demirovich, with a quote from Adorno. On the other hand, quote, community for community's sake is no ideal. Declaring togetherness as such the goal indicates that one has forgotten about the substance of community, a humane arrangement of the world. The cult of community as an end in itself belongs to the National Socialists and the People's Democracies in the Russian style. It is essentially totalitarian. Within it, the tendency towards the oppression of the individual constantly resonates. However, a real community would be one of free human beings, end quote. Adorno. End footnote. Quote, for a liberated humanity, the qualitative diversity of the bygone and obsolete would be absolved, end quote. Adorno. Footnote. Here, Wayne Whitson Floyd recognizes, quote, Adorno's eschatological vision, diversity without domination, end quote. Floyd, 1993. End footnote. Adorno's, quote, criticism of the ideal of equality is directed at a state of richness, in which it would be, bracket, repressive to count the beefsteaks which everyone eats, end bracket, because everyone, bracket, could, end bracket, eat as much as they want, bracket, anyway, end bracket, whereas, quote, bracket, some might be ashamed to keep eating meat, end bracket, in such a situation. As long as, bracket, that, end bracket, time has not come, the vulgar materialist phrase of sharing is right, end quote. Until then, there is, quote, tenderness only in the coarsest demand, that no one shall go hungry any more, end quote. That's good shit, too. I'm going to keep reading. In several places, Adorno points to the already existing possibilities for emancipation enabled by the contemporary state of the forces of production. Footnote. See, for example, Adorno, 2003, quote, the forces of production, the material forces of production, have today developed such that if society were arranged rationally, material hardship would no longer be necessary, that such a state could be produced, and indeed throughout the world, in Tellurian measure, would have been written off as crassly utopian in the 19th century, ... Because the objective possibilities have been so infinitely expanded, the kind of critique of the concept of utopia, which oriented itself on continued shortage, actually has no more currency, end quote. Adorno. Adorno elaborates the same thought with a slightly different choice of words in History and Freedom. End footnote. Yet possibilities alone are not enough to bring about the establishment of a truly emancipated society. After all, the fact that overabundance is produced while deprivation of the most basic necessities prevails is not an administrative problem. Rather, the former results from the latter. Even if capitalism were overcome and the forces of production liberated, this would not suffice to reconcile society, that is, to reconcile the contradiction between the universal and the particular. The material sustenance of all would not preclude a new form of domination, nor would it alone be the guarantor of a, quote, happiness of mankind that would be the happiness of individuals, end quote. Adorno. Already in 1944, Adorno writes that one can at least say, quote, that in today's objective situation, the thought of a necessary transitional period to absolute socialism contradicts the status, bracket, of the material forces of production, and bracket, so much that it almost sounds like an excuse for, bracket, the domination which is becoming entrenched. Even so, to be fair, and bracket, one has to say that even the most thoughtful of all Marxists, those who in fact, bracket, are Marxists no longer, and bracket, imagine the first phase much shorter than the Christians, the time between the birth of Jesus and the Parousia, a period of time which covers the whole of temporality, end quote. Adorno. Just exchange, therefore, does not indicate a standard of action to be observed in the future. Rather, just exchange names the precondition for the possibility of overcoming injustice and the compulsion of identity. Only simultaneously can the compulsive action and the principle on which it is based be superseded. Quote, the notion that deprivation shall not exist, that no one in the world shall go hungry anymore. In other words, the notion that the abolition of distress be fulfilled itself requires an increase in the forces of production and thus the domination of nature. Not only is this increase deeply entwined with the anti-materialist principle, it is only conceivable in the first place insofar as human beings, who in their domination of external nature are supposed to learn to dominate themselves, are constantly subjected to disallowances. The conception of a state without disallowances, the unfettering of the forces of production, the elimination of distress. That is, to be possible at all, the utopian element of unlimited fulfillment indeed requires, in order to be possible at all according to its own sense, limitation, asceticism, a particular element of repression, of oppression, end quote. Adorno. For Adorno, the continued history of humanity will be decided by, quote, whether it will succeed in getting out of this terrible bind, what the alternative means and what shall lead to the alternative in order to realize itself, develops within itself the principle against which it turns. Thus, this alternative stands in constant danger of regressing back into myth, end quote. Adorno. The increase in society's productive capacity extends domination, whatever its form, and thus perpetually constitutes a, quote, change which is necessary for everything to stay the same, end quote. Demirovich. In spite of all dynamics internal to society, the whole of society, quote, always remains the same. The persistence of, quote, prehistory, end quote, Adorno, which is, quote, realized as constantly different, unforeseen, exceeding all expectations, the faithful shadow of developing productive forces, end quote. Adorno. The constant development of the forces of production, itself an expression of the, quote, reckless domination of nature, end quote, is a blind element of ever sameness, of what Adorno grasps as myth. Footnote. Regarding the idea of the, quote, unleashing of productive forces, end quote, Adorno suggested that the, quote, very word, quote, unleashed, end quote, bracket, entfesselt, end bracket, has undertones of menace, end quote. Adorno, end footnote. For Adorno, Marx as well fails to escape the, quote, metaphysics of the forces of production, end quote, as he presupposes, quote, something like the metaphysical substantiality of ... productive forces, end quote. Adorno, which is, quote, reminiscent of the Hegelian world spirit, end quote. Adorno. This is very much, there's a lot of similarity to this, I think, to the critique of productivism by people like Castoriadis. Perhaps Christos Mamos says something like that in his book on Castoriadis, but I can't remember off the top of my head. The consequence of this, Adorno argues, is, quote, the persistence in Marx of a highly dubious theorem of German idealism. We find it explicitly stated above all by Engels and Anti-Düring. This is the assertion that freedom really amounts to doing consciously what is necessary, something that is of course meaningful only if it is necessary. The world spirit, the development of the forces of production is in the right, a priori, and its victory is guaranteed. This belief is one that has led to some catastrophic consequences, in particular all the anti-liberal and anti-authoritarian perversions to which the doctrine of Marx and Engels has been subjected with its installation in the states of the Eastern Bloc. End quote. Adorno. As Adorno says in the same passage, this expression was coined by Alfred Seidel, a friend from his youth. Quote, to be able to give a unified account of history, Marx, like Hegel, had to assume one agent of history. Yet Marx rejected the Hegelian metaphysics of spirit and replaced it, realist that he was, with economy, ... So it was that the agent of history could only be an economic agent, and indeed the factor which summoned or increased the productivity of labor. That is, the, quote, forces of production, end quote, ... Because these were supposed to be the agent of history, they were absolutized and elevated to a metaphysical entity, albeit an eminently metaphysical one, in unconscious analogy with the religious metaphysical. That is, the transcendent metaphysical philosophy of history, from the Old Testament to Hegel, end quote. Seidel. End footnote. Although Adorno believes that Marx, quote, in principle, thought dialectically, end quote, he maintains that, quote, forces of production nonetheless gain a certain metaphysical character in Marx's work, end quote, something which Marx, quote, adopted directly from Saint-Simon, end quote. It's interesting, just as a side note. If you're interested in these topics, I have a book on here called Towards the Critique of Technology, which is about the capitalistic nature of contemporary, the material substratum, or the physical substratum, the technological substratum of capitalist society as the recreation of the production process and capital's own image. I have a couple things in here. One, if you want to go straight to the source, you can check out the piece on here, The Results of the Immediate Production Process by Marx, which talks about real and formal subsumption. But also check out the pieces on here from a book called Toward the Critique of Technology, edited by a guy named Phil Slater. I can't remember the woman's name, but it's like Monica something Felt, Reichfeld or Reidefeld or Redefeld, I don't know, something like that. But it's called The Critique of Technology. But also check out the book as a critique of technological determinist interpretations of Marxism, put forward by, in the book, The Violence of Abstraction by Derek Sayer, which is like an extended critique of a book by G.A. Cohen titled In Defense of Marx's Theory of History or something like that, which is like kind of like a recapitulation of Marx's of basically dogmatic orthodox Marxism, which a lot of people would say like isn't really Marx, but is like Marxism but Engelsism, right? Kind of like based upon like a few sketchy remarks in the introduction to a contribution to the critique of political economy, I believe from 1859. But he goes on, he elaborates, he argues like to not interpret Marxism in this way. So it's kind of like a thing, that's kind of like a tension, an interesting tension within the history of Marx is like people critiquing, there's like a debate on what is like there's a shared consensus that say technological determinism is inaccurate, false, and has certain authoritarian, heteronymous, fetishistic, anti-humanist consequences, right? And there's people that say, okay, that's Marx, and then there's people that say, like, there's not Marx. That's not Marx. So people like Adorno and I think Castoriadis, who I mentioned before, be one of those people that say, okay, that is Marx. That is, like, not drawing like a very stark any kind of distinction between, say, Marx and like traditional Marxism or orthodox Marxism or whatever you would like to call it. And then there's other people that say, no, that's not Marx. They'll say, no, that's they use like instances like what I just mentioned, like the above mentioned or previously mentioned results of the immediate production process to say, no, like Marx, there's things in Marx that, there's tensions, obviously, but there's things in Marx that himself that point against technological determinism, such as like the subsumption of like technical processes under social forms, right? And there's also analogously, there's like there's people like Maximilien Rubel or Daniel Guérin who share like a very like libertarian communist positions, I would say. But as Rubel kind of characterizes Marx as a libertarian himself, Guérin says no, Marx was not a libertarian, even though there's like libertarian moments in them overall. Rubel's exaggerating a bit. So there's kind of like, it's an interesting thing. And so like some people say, I write off Marx altogether based upon rejecting this kind of orthodox traditional Marxism kind of view. Or maybe not write them off, but like not view it as necessary to call themselves a Marxist. Which I think it doesn't matter, whether or not someone calls themselves a Marxist. What actually matters is like the content of what they're saying, and whether it's coherent and emancipatory in its ideas. But yeah, there's like there's this tension between like, is this interpretation of Marx, for instance, that Adorno is putting forward, actually Marx, or is it something else? Is it Engelsism? Is it traditional Marxism? Is it so-called Weltanschauung or worldview Marxism? So that's like a tension. Just to note that. I'm sure if you're listening to this, you probably already know that. You probably know more about critical theory and Marx than myself. But just something to think about. Anyway, although Adorno believes that Marx, quote, in principle thought dialectically, end quote, Adorno maintains that, quote, the forces of production nonetheless gain a certain metaphysical character in Marx's work, end quote, something which the Marx, quote, adopted directly from Saint-Simon. Moreover, Adorno argues Marx was, quote, forced by his, quote, historical optimism, end quote, to, quote, give the forces of production the final say, end quote. Adorno. Footnote. Claude-Henri de Rouvois, Comte de Saint-Simon, lived from 1760 to 1825. In his day, a friend and teacher of Auguste Comte, was an early sociologist now considered to be among the founding fathers of the discipline. With the, quote, pathos of revolutionary 18th century bourgeois culture, end quote, Adorno, Saint-Simon represented progress in the sense of the, quote, unfolding of the technical forces of production, end quote. Quote, the most important question, that quote was from Adorno. Quote, the most important question in connection with Saint-Simon is the question of whether harmony might actually be enabled by an ever-intensifying development of the forces of production. In the meantime, this belief has passed away, its antithesis formulated in the theories of class, in which the totality of society is viewed as the self-moving and actively self-reproducing contradiction. Simplified, quote, dialectics, end quote, for Marx means the development of the forces of production through the class opposition, only the elimination of which can lead to harmony, end quote. Adorno. End footnote. Additionally, Adorno claims that, quote, Marx tended to see the forces of production as the stronger factor relating to his teleological understanding of history, while Weber tended to emphasize the key importance of the relations of production in society. This difference may express, not least the distinct historical phase in which Weber lived as opposed to Marx. Now the objective forms of society have consolidated infinitely. Confidence in the primacy of productive forces and social development shaken, end quote. Adorno. Adorno turns against this tendency in his off-cited aphorism titled Sur l'eau, I don't know if I'm saying that right, SURL apostrophe EAU, in Minima Moralia, the closest he comes to positively describing a fulfilled utopia. This utopia would consist precisely of a human existence beyond production's coercion. Quote, the naive supposition of an unambiguous development towards increased production is itself a piece of that bourgeois outlook which permits development in only one direction because, integrated into a totality, dominated by quantification, it is hostile to qualitative difference. If we imagine emancipated society as emancipation from precisely such totality, then vanishing lines come into view that have little in common with increased production in its human reflections. If uninhibited people are by no means the most agreeable or even the freest, a society rid of its fetters might take thought that even the forces of production are not the deepest substratum of man, but represents a historical form adapted to the production of commodities. Perhaps the true society will grow tired of development and out of freedom leave possibilities unused, instead of storming under a confused compulsion to the conquest of strange stars. A mankind which no longer knows want will begin to have an inkling of the delusory, futile nature of all the arrangements hitherto made in order to escape want, which used wealth to reproduce want on a larger scale, end quote. End quote, Adorno. It's beautiful. Here Adorno refers to the Marxian discourse on relations of production as a, quote, fetter on the mode of production. In a central passage in Capital, Marx writes, not without pathos, of the centralization of capitals, placing his trust in a kind of historico-philosophical anomaly, which finds no support in Marx's actual critique of political economy. Quote, one capitalist always strikes down many others. Hand in hand with this centralization or this expropriation of many capitalists by a few, other developments take place on an ever-increasing scale, such as the growth of the cooperative form of the labor process, the conscious technical application of science, the planned exploitation of the soil, the transformation of the means of labor into forms in which they can only be used in common, the economizing of all means of production by their use, as the means of production of combined socialized labor, the entanglement of all peoples in the net of the world market, and with this the growth of the international character of the capitalist regime, along with the constant decrease in the number of capitalist magnates who usurp and monopolize all the advantages of this process of transformation, the mass of misery, oppression, slavery, degradation, and exploitation grows. But with this, there also grows the revolt of the working class, a class constantly increasing in numbers, and trained, united, and organized by the very mechanism of the capitalist process of production. The monopoly of capital becomes a fetter upon the mode of production, which has flourished alongside and under it. The centralization of the means of production and the socialization of labor reach a point at which they become incompatible with their capitalist integument. This integument is burst asunder, the knell of capitalist private property sounds, the expropriators are expropriated, end quote. Marx. To conceive of growth in the forces of production and in material wealth as progress is itself the product of a concept of history which Adorno refuses to abide. As long as human beings must dominate nature, nature will also dominate them. For in their attempt to elevate themselves over nature, socialized individuals only become further entangled in it. If nature no longer needed to be dominated, humanity would no longer stand powerlessly at nature's mercy. At that point, nature, the progenitor of the human being which, quote, posits, end quote, itself as non-nature, would perhaps be reconciled as totality in such a way that the human being, I think it's supposed to say that, would perhaps be reconciled as totality in such a way that human beings, who would now be an element of nature instead of an appendage, could shape nature's history, which would no longer be prehistory, in accordance with a reason no longer conceived of as distinct from and opposed to nature. As the result of determinate negation, the reconciliation between subject and object hoped for by Adorno would affect not only subjects. Reconciliation does not mean a return to nature, but rather a transcendence of the dichotomy between nature and society, or between, quote, first and, quote, second nature, end quote. Reconciliation between subject and object, the, quote, theological archetype, end quote, of Adorno's utopia, quote, would release the non-identical, would rid it of coercion, including spiritualized coercion. It would open the road to the multiplicity of different things and strip dialectics of dialectics' power over them. Reconcilement would be, bracket, thinking, and bracket, of bracket, multiplicity, and bracket, as no longer inimical. A bracket thinking, and bracket, that is anathema to subjective reason. Dialectic serves the end of reconcilement, end quote. Adorno. Quote, the qualities would simply fall into the lap, end quote, only of a reconciled social process, one which has been, quote, freed from exchange, end quote. Adorno. For Adorno, negative dialectics means, quote, to recognize and accept the object, the other, the alien, end quote. For Adorno, this is the only way to move beyond the object's negative primacy, which is to say, beyond, quote, domination over powerless individuals by social forces that, bracket, have and bracket, become autonomous, society's condition when it lacks an overall subject, end quote. Vigor's house. Although, quote, the non-identical has no positive existence, end quote, Adorno, as long as, quote, the spell of universal identity, end quote, prevails, it can be accessed by a mode of thinking which respects, quote, that which is to be thought, the object, even where the object does not heed the rules of thinking, end quote. Adorno. Quote, concepts alone can achieve what the concept prevents. Cognition is something in Greek, or in other words, a means to heal the wounds which cognition itself strikes, end quote. Excuse me, that's not a quote, end quote. That's Jesus Christ. Let me repeat that. Quote, concepts alone can achieve what the concept prevents. Cognition is something in Greek, end quote, or in other words, a means to heal the wounds which itself strikes. Footnote. This phrase comes from the Greek myth of the Arcadian, parenthesis, and mythical founder of Pergamon, and parenthesis, Telephus, who was wounded by Achilles, and, parenthesis, depending on the version of the narration, in parenthesis, then later healed by him. Quote, only the spear which strikes the wound can heal the wound, and vice versa. Only the cure can also be the poison, and as such can function as a cure again. To metaphysics, spear and pharmacon are metaphysical language itself, end quote. See Hecker, 2001. End footnote. Quote, the determinable flaw in every concept makes it necessary to cite others. Bracket, in this arise those constellations which are the sole inheritors, in bracket, of some of the hope of the name. The language of philosophy approaches that name by bracket negating itself, end bracket, end quote. Adorno. Under the spell of identity, the non-identical can only be recognized as something negative, whose outline is traced by the borders of positive concepts. Where the latter do not reach, the former is to be located. Quote, thus in philosophy we are obliged to make use of concepts in order to talk about concepts. And this means that what we are concerned with in philosophy, namely the non-conceptual, that which the concepts refer to, is excluded from philosophy from the outset. Thus, by virtue of its own methodology, philosophy bars philosophy's own way to what it wishes to achieve, namely to be in a position to judge matters that are not itself, that are not concepts. And I would like to suggest quite simply as a program, that philosophy should reflect conceptually on this process in which it deals only with concepts and, by raising it to the level of the concept, should revise it and reverse it again, insofar as this can be achieved with conceptual methods, end quote. Adorno. Only in this way, Adorno believes, could philosophy realize what he considers to be philosophy's genuine task, to, quote, say what cannot be said, against Wittgenstein, end quote. Adorno. Adorno pays just as little heed to Wittgenstein's premise that, quote, the world is all that is the case, end quote. Wittgenstein, as he does to the imperative derived from it, quote, what we cannot speak about we must pass over in silence, end quote. Wittgenstein. For Adorno it is nothing less than, quote, cardinal untruth, having recognized an existence to be bad, to present it as truth simply because it has been recognized, end quote. Adorno. Quote, the task of philosophy, I would like just to say, is the complete opposite of what is postulated in the famous saying by Wittgenstein, which concludes his Tractatus, end quote. Adorno. Section 5, this core. In his, quote, Hornberger letter from 1935, Adorno writes Benjamin that a, quote, restoration of theology, or better still, a radicalization of dialectic, introduced into the glowing heart of theology, would simultaneously require the utmost intensification of the social dialectical and indeed economic motifs, end quote. Letter from Adorno to Benjamin, 2nd to the 4th of August, 1935, end footnote. Adorno's philosophy is always the attempt to pin down this economic motif. Economy here means neither merely capitalism nor social production as such. Rather, economy concerns how subjects deal with themselves and with other subjects or objects. It aims, and this is the critical element of Adorno's philosophy, inseparable from its material, at the possibility of human togetherness in view of the impossibility of immediate unity. Although Adorno sees the world as under the, quote, spell of universal identity, end quote, this does not lead Adorno to quietism and, quote, we can't do anything about it, end quote, mentality, end quote, Adorno. Which is the practical consequence of what his theory criticizes. Adorno does not think that, quote, because we ruthlessly define the block state and disproportionate power relationships of the present situation, we should therefore be branded with quietism or resignation. For anyone who shrinks back from analyzing the existing structure for the sake of a thesis to be demonstrated or a goal to be achieved thereby betrays both truth and theory, and that is quite certainly not what has ever been meant by the unity of theory and practice, end quote. Adorno. Even though Adorno engages more intensively following the Second World War with the Marxian critique of political economy, he is never exclusively concerned with the critique of the capitalist mode of production in particular. Rather, Adorno views this mode of production as emerging in a historical phase in which the meta-economy became an economy in the narrower sense, a quote, special case of, end quote, the more general phenomenon of economy. Adorno is concerned with a negative philosophy of history, that is, with a history without a, quote, total subject, however construable, end quote. Adorno. And precisely for this reason remains a prehistory in which human beings, in spite of all attempts to gain control, remain fatefully trapped in nature. Adorno's social critique seeks to reconcile contradictions through determinate negation, which has no positive upshot as long as the principle of identity prevails, a principle expressed economically in the exchange of like for like, and in a broader sense leads to the rupture between object and subject. Adorno's critique of political economy is the critique of a society which is still the constant result of a historical progression, a progression which, in all of its immanent dynamics, remains a static whole, insofar as it does not move beyond itself, but rather is always only a means to its own end, progress in and for itself. Adorno recognizes that the weakness of the critique of economy as practiced by Marx is that it falls back into a, quote, reified and often truly, quote, economistic, end quote, mode of thinking, end quote, and thereby falls victim to a, quote, fetishization of the sphere of the economy, end quote. Letter from Adorno to Jürgen von Kempski, 27th of January, 1950. Against this, Adorno seeks, quote, to bring out the dialectical core of Marxian economy, which it contains, so to speak, in spite of itself, and to show that the decisive concepts such as commodity, forces of production, and rate of profit really do, quote, move themselves, end quote. Yet this is only possible if they are not conceived of as a system of national economy, not even as the representation of the capitalist economy's laws of development, as Marx himself intended, but rather as objectively controlled by the critical intention at their conceptual core. Marx did not want to describe the dynamic of free and just exchange. Rather, Marx plays the melody of, quote, c'est vous Bayard, or Bayard, S-E space V-U-O-L space B-A-L-L-A-R-E, end quote. You speak of free and just exchange, fine, you shall have it, but in the process it will be revealed that precisely by fulfilling its concept, it becomes the opposite of free and just exchange, that its sense namely excludes the appropriation of surplus value. Put less economistically, elevated to a totality, the exchange relation results in the class relation. Equal is unequal, and this core, which is of course the last thing orthodox exegetes of Marx will admit, we indeed regard as dialectical, end quote. Adorno. That phrase I was trying to pronounce, c'est vous Bayard, translates as, if you want to dance, my little count, an aria from Mozart's Marriage of Figaro, It is also cited by Marx and Engels in an article in the Neue Rheinische Zeitung from the 12th of August, 1848. Adorno was probably made aware of the phrase by the introduction of the, quote, critique of Hegel's critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, according to which the, quote, petrified conditions must be made to dance by singing to them their own melody, end quote. Marx. End footnote. Although the capitalist mode of production represents a radical break with all previous relations of production, this mode of production itself ultimately remains within the continuity of subjects' domination over objects. For Adorno, the primary principle of all domination is that of identity, whose economic derivation is equivalence, the index of all measurement. Adorno's critique of economy is a critique of economy in general, which, as a thing in itself, is the universal rationality for all, a rationality present in those meta-economic principles around which the world is forcibly arranged. Because negative utopia is just as all-encompassing as its, quote, positive and, quote, inverse material critique, it sustains, quote, all its hopes as worries, end quote. Shu, 2006. Its rigidity owes to the desire to transcend critique and utopia in one. In the reconciled state, both would no longer be necessary. Something's missing, and not something which can already be conceived, let alone articulated, in the here and now. Just as realized utopia does not await its emanation from beyond, neither can an image or concept of this utopia be revealed. Between what currently exists and realized utopia, there would necessarily be a rupture, yet this rupture would be accomplished by a continuity with what exists, and ensured by determinate negation, without which it cannot happen. Footnote. Precisely this strength of the Adornian concept of utopia, its refusal to bow down to what appears possible in the here and now, for the sake of practical expedience, is lamented by Krakauer in a letter to Löwenthal, and characterized as a weakness. According to Krakauer, the concept of utopia in Adorno's work is, quote, entirely impermissible, end quote, insofar as it is, quote, used as a pure limiting concept, Grenzbegriff, which lacks even the slightest substance. He doesn't see utopia, end quote. Letter from Krakauer to Löwenthal, 15th of February, 1960. End footnote. For Adorno, what follows this rupture is not a, quote, positive absolute, end quote, as Horkheimer hopes in his late phase, but rather something which can only be created by human beings. Precisely for this reason, hope does not rely on a notion of will, understood as akin to a divinity. Instead, hope attaches itself to the determinate negation of what exists by virtue of a practice, whose possibility must nevertheless first be established. And that's the end of chapter 13 of Adorno's Critique of Political Economy by Dirk Braunstein, edited by Adam Baltner.